Two bikers thought they were attacking an ordinary Navy commander, but they made the biggest mistake of their lives. What happened next will leave you speechless. Have you ever had the feeling that your day was about to change, but never imagined it would be in such a shocking way? Imagine for a second that you're just doing your job, and suddenly someone tries to attack you without knowing who you really are. For two bikers, this moment not only changed their lives forever, but also revealed how deceptive appearances can be. But what they didn't know was that the person they chose to attack wasn't just any commander. She was someone with far more power, more strength, and more training than they could have imagined. And what's worse, they never realized they were making a fatal mistake until it was too late. It was a hot summer's afternoon when the two bikers, in their leather jackets and dark helmets, decided that this was the day they would finally take control of a situation they had been planning for days. But what they didn't know was that everything they were about to do would turn out to be an irreparable mistake. They were on an isolated road, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, where the silence was profound and only the sound of motorcycles broke the monotony of the environment. For them, it was the perfect place to carry out a quick and uncomplicated attack. The choice of target was casual. They had no intention of attacking anyone in particular, but when they spotted the lone woman on the road, she seemed the ideal victim. Their vehicle, an imposing motorcycle, was driven by a woman who seemed to be on a mission alone, calmly, without suspecting any danger around her. To the bikers, she was just another Navy commander going about her daily routine. Nothing more than an ordinary woman with a significant position, but who deep down represented easy prey for the two men who considered themselves unbeatable. They knew nothing about her, nor about her abilities, nor about the courage that was about to emerge. What they saw in those seconds was just a Navy commander, perhaps with some combat experience, but far from being a threat to two trained and armed men. It was a false sense of superiority fueled by arrogance and conceit. They believed they could dominate any situation, and at that moment, they were convinced that she would be no different from the other victims they had attacked before. But things wouldn't turn out the way they imagined. The moment they made the decision to act, a series of events was set in motion, and what was initially a simple and straightforward plan turned into a nightmare of unforeseen consequences. They accelerated their bikes and approached her with speed, ready to act quickly. The sound of the motorcycles whizzing behind her was the first clue that something was wrong, but the commander, unaware of what was to come, still hadn't reacted. She was absorbed in her own thoughts as she drove along the deserted road, perhaps thinking about a report to deliver or the mission ahead of her. Suddenly, she felt the change in the air. The sound of motorcycles growing, the pressure of the wind intensifying, and a feeling of unease, as if she were being watched. But she didn't panic, and that was the bikers' first big mistake. They underestimated the instinct of someone who, for years, had been trained to deal with extreme situations, to notice the subtlest signs and react immediately. At that moment, the commander knew something was about to happen, but contrary to what the bikers expected, she didn't panic. She began to analyze the situation logically, strategically. In seconds, she made a mental calculation of her options. The choice not to react immediately was the first decision that would make all the difference. When the bikers got close enough to start their attack, the commander was ready. They thought it would be a simple approach, a quick onslaught, with a violent move that would make them dominate the situation. What they couldn't imagine was that the woman on the motorcycle had been trained to deal with these kind of clashes. She was no ordinary Navy commander. She was an expert in combat tactics, a woman with the discipline and endurance of a warrior. And most importantly, she knew that fear was never an option. The bikers were now very close. They sped up, armed with knives and irrational audacity. They intended to destabilize the commander with a surprise attack, perhaps intimidate her enough to make her give up resisting. But instead of being taken by surprise, she prepared for the ambush with deadly calm. Everything she had learned during her years of military service was not only for combat against visible enemies, but also for situations where her own life was at risk. She was there to prove that nothing could shake her. When the first motorcyclist tried to make a sudden move to attack her, she had already moved to the right, using the speed of her bike to swerve nimbly, taking the enemy by surprise. Her reaction was instantaneous, without hesitation, as if she had already anticipated their move. But the bikers, now surprised by the woman's resistance, tried to accelerate faster to surround her. They approached again, but that's when the real confrontation began. They had never imagined that someone so seemingly ordinary could be so skilled. They thought that the commander would just be an easy victim and not the storm that had descended upon them. Trying to corner her, one of the bikers tried a direct attack, moving quickly to the side of his bike. But the commander, with a precise and calculated move, turned towards him, shaking off his maneuver with impressive speed. She didn't just avoid the blow. She used the same force of the movement to strike back, and even more effectively. The biker was thrown to the side, disoriented and with his heart racing, trying to understand what had happened. It was at that very moment that the bikers began to realize that they had made a much bigger mistake than they had imagined. Not only had they underestimated the commander, but they had also failed to calculate the true extent of her abilities. Their plan was failing, and from that moment on, the scales of the fight were rapidly tipping against them. Confusion overtook the bikers as one of them tried to regain his balance after being knocked down by the commander. The sound of motorcycles, once a symbol of power and control, was now mixed with the sound of metal scraping on asphalt and the muffled screams of a man who clearly hadn't expected to lose control so quickly. He looked at his colleague, who was still trying to react, a shocked expression on his face. The commander, with her experience and training, was in complete control of the situation, and the previously confident bikers were now being dragged through a maelstrom of emotions they had never experienced before. With the attack thwarted, the commander began to move her bike in circles, creating a strategic distance. She didn't just want to escape, she wanted to dominate the space around them, maintain control of the situation, and, above all, ensure that these two men had no chance of prevailing. But there was something else there, something she knew deeply. She couldn't just win this physical battle. There was a psychological war going on, a test of courage and intelligence, and she would not allow the bikers to see her as a victim. The reality of the situation was becoming clearer and clearer to her. The men weren't just brash criminals. They were something more, something she needed to understand. They were there for something other than what it initially seemed. She knew that this ambush was no accident. Something had drawn these two men to her, and the only way to win was not only to protect herself physically, but also to uncover their intentions. Adrenaline was already coursing through her veins, but she needed to keep a cool head. The first biker was already getting back on his feet, his hands now firmly positioned on his bike as he tried to stand up. The second man, on the other hand, seemed more determined, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that wasn't just anger, but something deeper, as if he was determined to show that he wouldn't be easily defeated. The commander, watching every move carefully, realized that time was running out. She couldn't wait indefinitely for the bikers to give up, because she knew that at any moment they would try again. She had to be faster, smarter. But what worried her most was the truth she was beginning to suspect. These bikers weren't just there by chance. Something bigger was at stake. The bikers, despite their fury and shame, began to reorganize themselves. The man who had been knocked down was now standing up, his expression mixed with pain and anger, but the second, who seemed to be the most calculating, was calmer, watching the commander with a studious gaze. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was analyzing the situation, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how he could turn the tables. The commander sensed that the mood had changed. The physical battle was no longer the focus. It was as if she had entered a kind of mental duel, a game of chess where the risk of failing meant much more than just losing control of the situation. She realized that, for them, she wasn't just a Navy commander. She was an obstacle to be overcome, a figure to be toppled so that they could advance their own goals. At that moment, she felt a wave of anger invade her mind. The anger wasn't directed at the bikers. It was directed at the fact that they had underestimated not only her position, but also her determination. They were treating her as if she were a disposable item, a woman who could be easily intimidated or defeated. But she wasn't like that. She knew that she would need to use all her experience to turn the tide. This was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of proving that she and everything she stood for would not be destroyed by two reckless bikers. She accelerated her bike towards the two, not with the intention of attacking immediately, but to force the two men to regroup. As she approached quickly, she observed their behavior. The first man seemed to hesitate, fear beginning to take over his mind. But the second, the more calculating, didn't seem shaken. Instead of moving away, he stood firm, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the atmosphere seem denser. The commander knew that her next move would be crucial. She had to trick them, distract their senses so that they could be beaten. The situation was tense, and the silence between them seemed to weigh more than any words could express. Every move she made was calculated. Every second counted as if it were her last. But what she didn't know was that the bikers were also preparing for a final move. They had initially made a mistake, but now they were ready to fight in a more calculated way. What was at stake was no longer just physical confrontation. It was a battle for control, for honor, for dignity. The commander knew that, regardless of who emerged victorious, the fight would leave deep scars, and the impact it would have on their lives would be permanent. She looked at the bikers, feeling the growing tension in their gazes. They were there, not just to win, but to prove something to themselves. As the two bikers prepared for their final assault, she was more determined than ever to show that nothing could shake her confidence, her mission, and, above all, her commitment to the truth. She knew it would be difficult, that the final confrontation could result in something she couldn't predict, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let herself be beaten, not without fighting to the last breath. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending everything she stood for as a Navy commander, and her honor was at stake. The tension was palpable in the air. The seconds seemed to drag by as the commander watched the bikers, who were now closer, ready for a confrontation that could decide everyone's fate. The decision to attack or retreat hung like a dark cloud over the heads of everyone involved. The silence that preceded the action was so profound that you could hear the rapid beating of hearts, the rubbing of clothes against skin, and the rumble of motorcycles, which were now mere instruments in a battle that would not be won with brute force, but with intelligence and strategy. The commander was in control of the situation, or so she wanted them to believe. She had prepared for everything: physical combat, brute violence, and even a mental confrontation. But what she didn't know was that the bikers had been watching her every move with watchful eyes, picking up on every mistake, every weakness, every hesitation. They were ready for the final move. And deep down, she knew she had to finish this soon. Because her body was starting to feel heavy, the adrenaline no longer enough to hide the tiredness that was beginning to take hold of her. The first biker, the one who had been knocked down at the start, advanced with surprising speed. He seemed to have overcome his shame and pain, as if he was fueled by something deeper, something she had yet to understand. But the commander was prepared. She knew he would try something daring, something that could be his last gamble, and she was ready for it. She accelerated her bike, cutting the distance between them with impressive precision. The shock was inevitable. When the two met in the middle of the road, the impact was so strong that the sound of the bikes colliding with the asphalt echoed in the emptiness of the night. But the real turning point happened there. The motorcyclist who had been attacking the commander with all his fury crashed into her uncontrollably. At the exact moment of the collision, the commander made the most daring move of her life. She got off the bike in a single agile movement, a maneuver that only someone with military training could execute with such dexterity. As she did so, she grabbed the biker's arm, using her own strength against him, making him lose his balance for good. It was a quick, merciless move. The surprise was total. The man, who had been so focused on knocking her down, couldn't react in time. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The commander, now facing one of the bikers immobilized on the ground, looked at the second man. He was in an attack position, but his expression was now doubtful. He hesitated, something the commander noticed immediately. This was the turning point. She knew he wasn't as sure as he had been before. What had seemed like a battle of strength was now becoming a fight for morale. The second biker knew that his companion had failed, and he was no longer as confident as he had been at the beginning. But the commander had no time to lose. She knew that he was still armed with a silent motivation, a furious impetus that could manifest itself at any moment. It was at that moment that the commander made the boldest move of all. She slowly approached the second biker, keeping her posture firm but without showing any weakness. She wasn't going to attack him straight away, no. She knew that the only way to gain the upper hand would be to destabilize him psychologically, to force the enemy to make a thoughtless decision. Her approach was simple but powerful. She looked straight into his eyes and said, in a calm, almost disinterested tone, "You can kill me, but what if your friend dies because of you? It will be the end of him and of you." She knew that this was his point of vulnerability. Doubt gripped the second biker. He looked at his companion, still lying on the ground, and for a brief moment hesitated. That moment of indecision was all the commander needed. She used his weakness to her advantage, taking the lead in the situation. The tension that had dominated the confrontation quickly dissolved. The biker, now emotionally broken, made the most disastrous move of all. He tried to pull away, backing up as if he were running away. That's when the commander made her final move. In one swift leap, she threw herself at the man, catching him off guard. He had no chance to react. The commander finally managed to immobilize him, and the two bikers were now on the ground, defeated not only by physical strength, but by mental strength. The battle had reached its climax. The commander, breathing heavily, slowly stood up. She had won, but not without paying a price. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was clear. She had overcome an attack that initially seemed impossible to beat. She knew that victory came not just from brute strength, but from the ability to analyze the situation, to break down enemies emotionally, to act with precision at the right moment. As she looked at the bikers lying on the ground, a sense of relief washed over her, but also a silent warning. What seemed like an isolated attack could have deeper roots. She knew that the bikers were not simply common criminals. They had been sent by something bigger, by an organization that probably wouldn't give up easily. But for now, she had won. And that victory, however difficult, was hers. And in her heart, she knew this moment had defined her. She was no longer just a Navy commander. She was someone who had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. But the questions remained in her mind. Who had sent these bikers? And what else was to come? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. She was ready for any challenge. The confrontation finally came to an end, but the commander's internal battle was far from over. As the bikers, now immobilized, were taken under guard, the commander felt the weight of what she had just faced. She knew she had won, but the taste of victory was bitter. There was something deeper at stake here. The bikers were not simple criminals, and that attack was not an isolated incident. Every move, every choice she had made had been crucial to her survival. But what unsettled her most was the feeling that all this had only been the beginning. The real threat, the one behind this attack, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. She knew that mental warfare was the hardest of all, and this was the first round of a bigger fight. Today's victory didn't mean that the battle was won, but that she had taken a crucial step in the right direction. With one last look at the captured bikers, the commander felt not satisfaction, but renewed certainty. She was ready for whatever came next. She had faced the chaos and emerged victorious, but she knew that the real test lay ahead. And with that, she prepared herself for the next challenge. The fight wasn't just physical. It was about mental toughness, courage in the face of the unknown, and the strength of an unbreakable will that kept her on her feet, ready to fight to the end. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.